power in England was never held by kings alone. For 900 years, much of it belonged to the House of Percy. They came out of Normandy with the Conqueror's armies and planted themselves in the wild north of England, where the land was hard and the border with Scotland was never quiet. Over the centuries that followed, they gathered castles, titles, and the loyalty of thousands. Until no king could rule the north without them, they made kings and unmade them. They fought beside the crown, and they rebelled against it. They lost everything, again and again. And yet they always returned. Fathers fell in battle. Sons were beheaded on the scaffold, and still the name endured. And when at last the bloodline faltered, it was saved by a child, a girl married 3 times before her 16th birthday, who carried the Percy name forward into the modern age. Tonight, we tell the whole story, slowly and softly. Welcome and rest easy. You've found Sleepy Nobles. If this is your first night with us, consider yourself one of the household now. And if you've sat with us before, it's good to have you back by the fire. So, lower the lights, rest your head, and let the cares of the day fall away. Tonight, we quietly open the doors of the House of Percy and tell their whole story, their rise, their power, and their place in history. Unhurried and gentle to carry you softly into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a quiet like and a gentle comment about which Percy you found most fascinating, help these stories find others who need them. In the year 1067, 1 year after the great battle that changed everything, a Norman lord crossed the Channel into England. His name was William de Percy, and he came from a small estate called Percy-on-Auge, tucked in the green countryside of Normandy. He was not among the most celebrated of the Conqueror's companions. He had not fought at Hastings, so far as the records show, but he arrived in England very soon after, perhaps with the Conqueror's wife Matilda, perhaps in the company of his sworn brother-in-arms, a powerful young Norman named Hugh de Vranchez, who would one day become the Earl of Chester. William de Percy had a curious appearance for a Norman. At a time when Norman lords were almost universally clean-shaven, he wore whiskers, a full moustache, or perhaps even a short beard in the fashion of the English. This earned him the nickname Augernon, which in the Old French of Normandy meant simply with whiskers. It was an oddity that would echo down the centuries, for later generations of Percys would adopt the whisker word itself as a Christian name, Algernon, and it would appear again and again in the family tree, all the way to the present day. How William came by his whiskers, no one can say for certain. One possibility is that he had spent time in England before the conquest. Perhaps he had been one of those Normans whom the old King Edward the Confessor had welcomed to his court, and who had been expelled when Harold Godwinson seized the throne. If that were so, then William's whiskers might have been a sign that he had lived among the English long enough to adopt their customs. But this is speculation. What is certain is that William de Percy arrived in England in 1067, and that he came to stay. The north of England, in those first years after the conquest, was a dangerous and unsettled place. The old English lords had not accepted Norman rule quietly. There had been rebellions, bitter, violent uprisings. And the Conqueror had responded with a campaign of devastation that later generations would call the harrying of the North. Whole villages were burned, crops were destroyed, and livestock was slaughtered. It was said that for years afterward, the roads of Yorkshire were lined with the unburied dead, and that the land between York and Durham was so thoroughly wasted that it lay barren for a generation. Into this ruined landscape came William de Percy. In the aftermath of the harrying, vast tracts of northern territory were granted to trusted Norman lords, men who could hold the land by force and keep it quiet. Hugh de Vranchez received the great earldom of Chester, and he in turn granted lands to his friend William de Percy. The Conqueror himself also bestowed estates upon Percy directly. By the time the great survey known as the Domesday Book was completed in 1086, William de Percy was recorded as the lord of more than 100 manors, scattered across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, with further holdings in Essex and Hampshire. He was, by any measure, a great landowner, one of the wealthiest Norman lords in northern England. He set about fortifying his holdings in the way that Norman lords did, building Motter and Bailey castles at Topcliffe and Spofforth in Yorkshire, establishing the centre of his barony at Topcliffe, and making himself the undisputed master of his corner of the north. These early castles were not the soaring stone fortresses of later centuries. They were earthwork and timber constructions, a raised mound topped with a wooden tower surrounded by a fenced enclosure. But they were effective. They announced the presence of a new lord, they provided a defensible stronghold in times of trouble, and they served as the administrative centre from which the business of the barony was conducted, the collection of rents, the settling of disputes, the mustering of soldiers. For William de Percy, the business of lordship was also the business of survival. The north of England in the years after the conquest was a volatile and unpredictable place. English resistance to Norman rule had not been fully extinguished, and the Danish threat, the possibility that Scandinavian raiders or invaders would appear on the Yorkshire coast, as they had done so many times before, was never entirely absent. To be a Norman lord in Yorkshire in the 1070s and 1080s was to live in a state of watchful readiness, surrounded by a population that, at best, tolerated you, and at worst, waited for the chance to rise against you. But William de Percy was not only a builder of castles, he was also a man of faith, or at the very least, a man who understood the value of piety in securing his legacy. At the request of a monk named Reinfrid, who had once served under him as a soldier, William undertook the restoration of Whitby Abbey, the ancient monastery on the Yorkshire coast that had been founded centuries earlier by the Anglo-Saxon abbess Hild, and which had been destroyed during the Danish invasions. The new Whitby Abbey, built with Percy money on the ruins of the old, would stand for centuries as a monument to the family's earliest days in England. William de Percy also married. His wife was an English noblewoman named Emma de Porte, and the sources tell us, with a gentle charm, that he married her as very heir to them, in discharging of his conscience, meaning that she had been the rightful owner of some of the lands he now held, and that he married her in part to set things right. It was a small act of justice in an age of conquest, and it bound the Norman intruder to the English soil in a way that mere land grants could not. William de Percy died around 1096, though the exact year is uncertain. Some sources give 1099. There is a tradition that he intended to join the First Crusade, that great wave of armed pilgrimage that carried tens of thousands of Christian warriors toward Jerusalem in those final years of the 11th century. Whether he actually departed, or whether death took him before he could set out, the records do not clearly say. What he left behind was a barony, a name, and the beginning of a dynasty. His son, Alan de Percy, inherited the barony and held it quietly through the early 12th century. Alan's son, William II de Percy, continued the line, but it was this third William who would prove to be the last of the original Percy male line. When he died around 1174 or 1175, he left no sons, only two daughters, Maud and Agnes. Maud died without children, and so the entire future of the House of Percy came to rest upon the shoulders of Agnes de Percy, a woman in an age when the weight of noble inheritance was supposed to pass through men. The situation facing Agnes was not unusual in medieval England. Great families lost their male heirs with grim regularity, carried off by disease, accident, or warfare. But it was always a moment of crisis. A family name in the medieval world was not merely a label. It was an identity, a brand, a banner around which loyalties were organized and estates were held. When the male line failed, the name was in danger of being absorbed into another family entirely, and with it would go the accumulated prestige, the network of alliances, and the sense of continuity that gave a noble house its power. Agnes made a marriage that would reshape the family forever. Her husband was a man named Jocelyn of Louvain, and he was no minor figure. He was the son of Godfrey I, Count of Louvain, a prince of the great House of Brabant on the continent, one of the most distinguished dynasties in Western Europe. More importantly for English politics, Jocelyn was the brother-in-law of King Henry I of England. For Henry's second wife, Adeliza of Louvain, was Jocelyn's stepsister. It was a connection of extraordinary prestige, linking the provincial Percy barony to both the royal house of England and the princely houses of the continent. When Jocelyn married Agnes, he did something that was not common among medieval lords, but was not unheard of either. He took her name. He became a Percy. It was a concession to the power and prestige of the Percy name, an acknowledgement that the identity he was marrying into was worth preserving. And from their union descended what historians call the Second House of Percy, a line that would carry the family name forward for another 5 centuries, through the greatest glories and the darkest tragedies of English history, until it too would face extinction in the male line, and be saved once more by a woman's inheritance. It is one of the quiet ironies of the Percy story that this most masculine of families, this dynasty of border warriors, kingmakers and rebels, was saved not once but twice by the courage and marriageability of its women. But that story lay far in the future. For now, in the late 12th century, the House of Percy had survived its first great crisis, the failure of the male line, and had emerged with fresh blood, a royal connection, and the same old name. The whiskers of William de Percy had given the family its start. The marriage of Agnes had given it its future. And let that thought settle gently as we move forward through the years, for the story of the Percys is only just beginning, and there is a very long road ahead. Through border wars and castle walls, through rebellion and ruin, through love and loss, and the slow, steady accumulation of power that would make them the uncrowned kings of the North. The generations that followed the marriage of Agnes de Percy and Jocelyn of Louvain were quieter ones, or at least they have left fewer dramatic stories in the records. The second House of Percy grew steadily in wealth and influence through the late 12th and 13th centuries, holding their barony of Topcliffe, managing their Yorkshire estates, and navigating the turbulent politics of Plantagenet England with the careful steadiness of a family that understood the value of patience. It was during these years that the family's connection to the great houses of Europe deepened. Through Jocelyn of Louvain, the Percys were now related by blood to the Dukes of Brabant, one of the most powerful dynasties on the continent. And through marriages in subsequent generations, to the Clifford family, to the Briware family, and to a branch of the Bruce family of Scotland, they wove themselves ever more tightly into the fabric of the English and Scottish aristocracy. But the true transformation of the House of Percy, the moment that turned them from wealthy Yorkshire barons into the dominant power of the North, came in the early 14th century, and it came through the vision and ambition of one man, Henry de Percy, the first Baron Percy of the new creation. Henry de Percy was born in 1273, and he grew up in a world that was being reshaped by the iron will of King Edward I, the king known as the Hammer of the Scots, the king who dreamed of uniting the entire island of Britain under the English crown. Edward's wars against Scotland would consume the last decades of the 13th century and the first years of the 14th, and they would draw the Percy family into a new role that would define them for generations to come. Henry de Percy became one of Edward I's most active and trusted agents in the subjugation of Scotland. He fought in the Scottish campaigns, served the crown faithfully, and was summoned to Parliament as a baron, a formal recognition of his standing among the highest ranks of the English nobility. But Henry was also a man who could read the political winds. When the fortunes of the Scottish wars began to shift, when Robert the Bruce emerged as a formidable leader and the dream of English domination began to falter, Henry de Percy quietly withdrew his focus from the failing Scottish enterprise and turned his attention to something more lasting. Until this point, the Percys had been a Yorkshire family. Their power base, their castles, their lands, all were centred in the rolling countryside of the North Riding. But Henry de Percy saw an opportunity in Northumberland, the wild, thinly settled county that stretched along the Scottish border, where the land was cheaper and the need for strong lordship was desperate. Around the year 1309, Henry de Percy made the purchase that would change everything. He bought Alnwick Castle. Alnwick was not, at that time, the grand palace it would later become. It was a border fortress, strong, functional, and strategically vital, guarding a crossing of the River Alne on the road that ran from England into Scotland. The castle had been built in the late 11th century by a Norman lord named Ivo de Vesey, and it had passed through several hands before coming into the possession of the Bishop of Durham, Anthony Beck. It was from Bishop Beck that Henry de Percy acquired it. The purchase of Alnwick was more than a real estate transaction. It was a statement of intent. By planting the Percy banner in Northumberland, Henry was declaring that his family's future lay not in the comfortable heartland of Yorkshire, but on the sharp edge of the kingdom. The borderland where England met Scotland, where raids and skirmishes were a fact of daily life, and where the lord who could keep the peace was the lord who held the real power. And so the Percys became border lords. From Alnwick they commanded the northeastern frontier, a stretch of country that was, in many ways, a world apart from the rest of England. The border between England and Scotland was not a neat line on a map. It was a shifting, contested zone of hills, rivers and moorland, inhabited by tough, independent communities whose loyalties were as fluid as the landscape. Cattle raiding, feuding, and small-scale warfare were part of the fabric of daily life. The great lords who controlled this territory needed to be soldiers, diplomats, and judges in equal measure, capable of mustering armed forces at short notice, negotiating with Scottish lords across the border, and dispensing justice to communities that often preferred to settle their disputes with swords rather than courts. The Percys served as wardens of the Scottish marches. The royal officials responsible for defending the border, administering justice in the border counties, and managing the uneasy relationship between England and Scotland. The wardenship was one of the most important and demanding offices in medieval England. The warden was, in effect, the king's representative on the frontier, the man who decided when to fight, when to talk, and when to look the other way. It was a role that demanded military strength, political cunning, and an intimate knowledge of the wild country and its people. It was also a role that gave its holder enormous power, the power to raise armies, to impose order, to reward friends, and punish enemies. In the hands of a family as ambitious as the Percys, the wardenship was not just an office, it was a foundation for near autonomous power, and it was a role that the Percys would hold on and off for the next 3 centuries, becoming so identified with the defence of the North that to speak of the border was, in many minds, to speak of the Percys. Henry de Percy, the first Baron, died in 1314, the same year that Robert the Bruce won his great victory at Bannockburn and secured Scottish independence. His son, Henry de Percy, the second Baron, continued the family's work in the north. And the second Baron's son, Henry Percy, the third Baron, expanded it further, serving in the wars in France during the early stages of what would become the 100 Years' War and fighting against the Scots whenever the border flared into violence. The third Baron married well. Brilliantly, in fact. His first wife was Mary of Lancaster, a granddaughter of Henry, Earl of Lancaster, the younger son of King Henry III. It was a connection to the royal blood of England, not close enough to place the Percys in line for the throne, but close enough to matter. In the world of medieval politics, where blood and lineage determined everything from military alliances to seating arrangements at banquets, a connection to the royal house was worth more than any amount of land or gold. It lifted a family out of the ordinary ranks of the aristocracy and placed it among the select circle of magnates who were considered, by birth and by right, to be the natural advisors and companions of the king. This marriage would matter enormously in the decades to come, for it gave the Percys a claim, distant but real, to stand among the great magnates of the realm, the lords whose blood touched the blood of kings. It also gave them a sense of their own importance that would, in time, bring them into conflict with the very crown whose blood they shared. The third Baron died in 1368 at Alnwick Castle, and he left behind two sons who would both play significant roles in English history. The elder was Henry Percy, who would become the first Earl of Northumberland, the man who would make and unmake kings. The younger was Thomas Percy, who would become the Earl of Worcester, a skilled soldier and diplomat who would share his brother's ambitions and, ultimately, his brother's fate. Together they would lead the House of Percy to the absolute peak of its power and to the very brink of its destruction. But that story lay ahead, and the road to it would be paved with war, betrayal, and one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in all of English history. But for now, in the middle years of the 14th century, the Percys were still rising. Alnwick Castle was growing stronger. The family's grip on the border was tightening. And the great dramas of the late medieval age, the overthrow of kings, the wars of rival dynasties, the clash of ambition and loyalty, were still waiting in the wings. Let the quiet image of Alnwick linger for a moment. The grey stone walls above the River Aln, the wide Northumberland sky, the distant hills where Scotland begins. This castle would be the Percy home for more than 700 years. Kings would come and go. Wars would rage and fade. But Alnwick would endure, and so would the family that called it home. The year 1377 was a year of endings and beginnings. Old King Edward III, who had reigned for 50 years and had led England through the glory days of the 100 Years' War, was dead. His grandson, Richard II, a boy of just 10 years, was crowned in his place. And at that coronation, standing among the great lords of the realm, was Henry Percy, the elder son of the third Baron, a man of 36, battle-hardened and ambitious. On that day, Richard II created Henry Percy the first Earl of Northumberland. It was the highest title the family had ever held, and it marked the formal arrival of the Percys among the very top rank of the English aristocracy. The Earl of Northumberland was no longer merely a border lord. He was one of the great magnates of the kingdom, a man whose voice carried weight in the councils of state, whose soldiers could tip the balance of wars, and whose loyalty was courted by every faction at court. Henry Percy, the first Earl, was a formidable figure. He served Richard II in numerous capacities, as a soldier, as a diplomat, as a keeper of the peace on the Scottish border. He held the office of Lord Marshal of England. He was a Knight of the Garter. And he was, for a time, one of the most loyal servants of the crown. But the first Earl was also a man who understood power, who it served, and when it shifted. And as the reign of Richard II wore on, as the young king grew into a willful and unpredictable monarch who alienated one great lord after another, the first Earl began to calculate. The crisis came in 1399, and it had been building for years. Richard II had always been a difficult king, vain, extravagant, suspicious, and increasingly convinced of his own divine right to rule without restraint. He had survived a great crisis in 1381, when the peasants' revolt had threatened to overwhelm his government, and he had emerged from that trial with a dangerous confidence in his own judgment. As the years passed, he grew more autocratic, more arbitrary, and more willing to punish those who opposed him. He exiled his enemies, confiscated their estates, and surrounded himself with a coterie of favourites who told him what he wanted to hear. The breaking point came when Richard seized the vast estates of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the Duke of Hereford, and the son of John of Gaunt, the wealthiest and most powerful nobleman in England, a prince of the royal blood whose Lancastrian inheritance was one of the great fortunes of the age. Richard's confiscation of these estates was not merely an act of political aggression, it was a declaration that no nobleman's property was safe from the crown's grasp, that the king could strip any lord of his lands and titles at will, without cause and without recourse. It was the kind of act that united the nobility against the king, because, if it could happen to Bolingbroke, it could happen to anyone. Bolingbroke, who was in exile on the continent at the time, made his decision. He would return to England. He would reclaim what was his. And if the opportunity arose, if events moved in his favour, he would take the throne itself. It was a gamble of enormous risk, but Bolingbroke was a man of courage and calculation, and he judged correctly that Richard had made himself so many enemies that a well-timed challenge might bring the whole edifice crashing down. When Bolingbroke landed in Yorkshire in the summer of 1399, the first Earl of Northumberland was among the first great lords to rally to his side. The decision was not impulsive. The first Earl had been watching Richard's reign with growing unease for years, and he understood that the seizure of Bolingbroke's estates was a threat to every great landowner in England, including himself. The Percys and the Bolingbroks were cousins, connected through the Lancastrian blood that ran in both their veins. And the first Earl saw in Bolingbroke's cause both justice and opportunity. He supported the Duke's march south. He helped negotiate Richard's surrender. He played a prominent part in the bewildered king's abdication. And when Henry Bolingbroke was crowned as King Henry IV, the Percys stood at his side, expecting to be rewarded. And rewarded they were. The first Earl was appointed Constable of England. His son, a young knight named Henry Percy, already famous for his exploits on the Scottish border, was made Warden of the East March and Justiciar of North Wales. His brother, Thomas Percy, was made Admiral of England and later Steward of the royal household. The Percys, in the autumn of 1399, were the most powerful family in England after the king himself. But it was the first Earl's son who would become the most famous Percy of them all. His name was Henry, like his father, and like so many Percys before and after him. But the world would know him by another name, a name given to him not by his own people but by his enemies. The Scots called him Hotspur. Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, was born on the 20th of May, 1364, probably at Alnwick, though the records are not entirely clear. From his earliest years he was raised for war. The Percy household was a military household, the household of border lords who lived in the shadow of Scotland, who measured their worth in battles fought and enemies turned back. Young Henry took to this life with an eagerness that bordered on recklessness. He was fast, he was fierce, he attacked before his enemies were ready, and he pressed forward when other men would have paused. It was this quality, this restless, almost compulsive aggression, that earned him the name Hotspur, The Scots, who faced him across the border in skirmish after skirmish, raid after raid, gave him the nickname as a kind of grudging tribute. He was the spur that was always hot, always ready, always driving forward. In an age when personal courage was the highest virtue a knight could possess, Hotspur embodied it completely. He fought the Scots throughout the 1380s and 90s, ranging up and down the border country in a ceaseless rhythm of raid and counter-raid that defined life on the marches. He understood the border, its hills and valleys, its crossing points and ambush sites, the temper of the men who lived there. He led his retainers north in summer and south in winter, always pressing, always pursuing, always ready to strike before the enemy expected him. In 1385, at the age of just 21, he was appointed Warden of the East March, one of the most demanding military offices in England, carrying with it responsibility for the defence of the entire northeastern border against Scottish incursion. It was a role that required not just courage, but judgment, diplomacy, and an intimate knowledge of the border communities on both sides. Hotspur brought courage in abundance. The judgment would come later, or perhaps it never quite arrived. He fought the French as well. He crossed the Channel and served in the continental campaigns that were the long, grinding continuation of the 100 Years' War. He served in Ireland. He gained experience of different kinds of warfare, siege, skirmish, pitched battle, and he brought that experience back to the border, where it made him more formidable than ever. The Battle of Otterburn, fought on the 19th of August 1388, was one of the most celebrated encounters on the Anglo-Scottish border. A Scottish raiding force under the Earl of Douglas had pushed deep into English territory, and Hotspur led a pursuing force to intercept them. The battle was fought at night, a chaotic, confused engagement in the moonlight. And though the Scots lost their commander Douglas, they won the field. Hotspur himself was captured and had to be ransomed, a humiliation that stung his pride but did nothing to diminish his reputation. The Scots respected him all the more for having fought so fiercely, even in defeat. He fought again at the Battle of Homildon Hill on the 14th of September, 1402, one of the great English victories of the Border Wars. A large Scottish invasion force led by Archibald, 4th Earl of Douglas, had crossed into Northumberland. Hotspur and his father intercepted them at Homildon Hill, near the town of Wooler, and the English archers, positioned on rising ground above the Scottish advance, unleashed a devastating barrage that shattered the Scottish ranks before the men-at-arms even engaged. The Scottish army was routed, Douglas himself was captured, along with several other Scottish lords of high rank. And the victory secured the border for years to come. It was after Homildon Hill that the first cracks appeared between the Percys and the king they had helped to crown. The problem was money, and the arrogance of a king who had forgotten how much he owed. Henry IV, perpetually short of funds, had shifted the enormous financial burden of the Scottish border wars onto the northern lords, onto the Percys above all, while failing to reimburse them for the costs they had already borne. Worse still, when the Percys captured the Earl of Douglas and other Scottish nobles at Homildon Hill, the king demanded that they hand over their prisoners without receiving the lucrative ransoms that were, by the customs of war, rightfully theirs. For the Percys, this was an insult beyond endurance. They had made Henry Bolingbroke a king. They had fought his wars. They had spent their own money defending his borders. And now the king was taking their prisoners and ignoring their debts. The relationship between the Percys and the crown, which had been built on mutual need and sealed with promises, began to unravel. And as it did, the first Earl and his son Hotspur began to entertain a dangerous thought, a thought that had destroyed greater families than theirs. They began to think about rebellion. By the summer of 1403, the break between the Percys and King Henry IV was complete. The grievances had piled up, unpaid debts, seized prisoners, broken promises, and beneath them lay a deeper resentment, a feeling that the king the Percys had crowned was not worthy of the crown they had given him. Hotspur, impulsive as ever, was the first to act. In early July of 1403, he raised his banner in rebellion. He began in Cheshire, a county that had been loyal to the deposed Richard II and where resentment of Henry IV still ran deep. The Cheshire men flocked to Hotspur's standard, experienced soldiers, many of them archers of fearsome skill, some of whom had served as bodyguards to the old king. Within days, Hotspur had assembled an army of perhaps 14,000 men. His plan was bold, but risky. He intended to march south to Shrewsbury, a strategic town in the Welsh borderlands where he would link up with the forces of Owain Glyndwr, the Welsh prince who had been waging his own rebellion against Henry IV. If the two rebel forces could unite, they would be strong enough to challenge the king directly. Meanwhile, Hotspur's father, the first Earl of Northumberland, was expected to bring his own army down from the north to join them. But the plan depended on speed, and speed was the one thing Hotspur could not control. Glyndwr was fighting in another part of Wales and did not know of Hotspur's plans. The first Earl's army was slow to move south, and King Henry, hearing of the rebellion, moved with a swiftness that caught the rebels off guard. The king force-marched his army toward Shrewsbury, determined to reach the town before Hotspur could link up with his allies. On the 21st of July, 1403, the two armies met on a field north of Shrewsbury, near a place called Hateley Field. It was late in the day, only a few hours before dusk, and the light was already fading. The king's army and Hotspur's rebel force were roughly equal in size, perhaps 14,000 men on each side. There were negotiations, last-minute attempts at compromise, but they came to nothing. Hotspur's uncle, Thomas Percy, the Earl of Worcester, reportedly carried the rebels' demands to the king, but brought back a message of defiance. Whether Worcester deliberately sabotaged the negotiations, or whether the king was simply unwilling to yield, is a question historians have debated ever since. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil up to that time. It was also the first major battle in which English longbowmen faced each other. The deadly weapon that had won so many victories against the French and the Scots was now turned inward. Englishman against Englishman, and the result was carnage. The opening volleys of arrows were devastating. Thousands of shafts darkened the sky, and men fell in rows on both sides. The Cheshire archers fighting for Hotspur were among the finest in England, and they inflicted terrible damage on the royal ranks. But the king's archers answered in kind, and soon the battlefield was littered with the dead and wounded. Then the men-at-arms engaged, and the fighting became close and savage. Sword against sword, mace against mace, axe against shield, men grappling in the trampled grass as the summer light began to fail. The noise of a medieval battle was overwhelming. The crash of steel, the screaming of the wounded, the shouted commands and battle cries, the thunder of armoured men pressing against each other in the terrible intimacy of hand-to-hand combat. Men fought in the fading light until they could barely see the colours on the surcoats of the men in front of them. Prince Henry, the king's eldest son, the 16-year-old Prince of Wales, the boy who would one day become Henry V and lead England to its greatest military triumph at Agincourt, was struck in the face by an arrow early in the battle. The arrowhead buried itself in the flesh below his left eye, penetrating deep into the bone. It was a wound that would have killed many men, and that would have sent almost anyone from the field. But the prince refused to leave. He pulled himself upright, bleeding and half-blinded, and continued to fight, leading his men from the front with a ferocious, almost reckless courage that would be remembered and celebrated for the rest of his life. The royal surgeons later extracted the arrowhead using a specially designed instrument, and the prince survived, carrying the scar for the rest of his days as a permanent reminder of the battle that had forged him into a warrior. On the rebel side, Hotspur was in the thick of it, as he always was, pushing forward, rallying his men, looking for the decisive moment. He may have been trying to reach the king himself, hoping that a single stroke could end the battle and the war. And then Hotspur fell. The exact circumstances of his death are disputed. Some accounts say he was struck by an arrow in the face when he raised his visor to see more clearly. Others say he was cut down in the press of hand-to-hand combat. Shakespeare, writing 2 centuries later, would dramatize his death as a personal duel with Prince Henry. A poetic invention, almost certainly not historical, but one that captured something true about the clash between the old rebel and the young prince who would succeed where his father had struggled. What is certain is that when Hotspur fell, the battle was decided. His men, seeing their leader dead, lost heart and began to flee. The royal forces pursued them, and the rout became a slaughter. Thousands died on both sides. Estimates range from several thousand to as many as 6,000 killed, though the true number is impossible to know. Among the dead, besides Hotspur, were many of the Cheshire gentry who had rallied to his cause. Thomas Percy, the Earl of Worcester, was captured. He was tried and executed 2 days later, his head displayed on London Bridge as a warning to other would-be rebels. As for Hotspur himself, King Henry was taking no chances. In the confused aftermath of any medieval battle, rumours were inevitable. Rumours that important men had survived, that they had escaped in the chaos, that they would return to fight another day. Hotspur's fame made such rumours particularly dangerous. If the common people believed that Hotspur was still alive, they might rally to his cause, and a second rebellion could erupt before the first had been properly extinguished. The king ordered Hotspur's body to be exhumed from its initial burial place at Whitchurch and displayed publicly, propped upright between 2 millstones in the market square of Shrewsbury, so that all of England could see that the great rebel was truly dead. It was not enough merely to announce Hotspur's death. The people had to see it, to look upon the face of the man they had admired and feared, and to understand that he was gone. After the body had been displayed, it was, according to some accounts, quartered. The head sent to York, the limbs distributed to other parts of the kingdom as a grim and unmistakable warning. It was a brutal end for a man who had been, just a few years earlier, one of the most celebrated knights in England. But it was also the custom of the age, the standard punishment for treason, applied without sentiment to great lords and common men alike. But Hotspur's death at Shrewsbury was not the end of his story. In death, he became larger than he had been in life. Shakespeare would immortalize him in the play Henry IV, Part 1, making him the fiery, impetuous, gloriously reckless warrior who burns too brightly to last. And centuries later, the football club Tottenham Hotspur would take his name because the Percy family had once owned land in the Tottenham area of London, and the name of the man who had been too brave for his own good seemed fitting for a team. But for the Percy family, Shrewsbury was a catastrophe. Hotspur was dead at 39. His uncle Worcester was dead. And the first Earl, who had failed to bring his army south in time, was left to face the consequences alone. The first Earl was not immediately destroyed. Because he had not been present at Shrewsbury, he could not be convicted of treason for the battle itself. He submitted to the king, lost his office of constable, and was for a time allowed to live in a kind of wary peace. But the first Earl was not a man who accepted defeat easily. In 1405, he entered into one of the most extraordinary agreements in medieval English history, the tripartite indenture, a secret pact between himself, Owain Glyndwr, and Edmund Mortimer, the Earl of March. Under this agreement, the three conspirators proposed to divide England among themselves. Glyndwr would receive Wales and a large part of western England. Mortimer would take the south, below the River Trent. And the first Earl of Northumberland would receive the entire north of England, along with several Midland counties. It was a breathtaking plan, a scheme to dismember the kingdom itself. But it never came to fruition. The rebellions of 1405 were suppressed, the Earl's allies were defeated, and Northumberland himself was forced to flee to Scotland. He returned once more in 1408 to make a final desperate bid for power. On the 20th of February, 1408, at the Battle of Bramham Moor in Yorkshire, the first Earl of Northumberland was killed. He was 66 years old. He had spent the last decade of his life in an escalating cycle of rebellion and submission, and in the end the cycle consumed him. The Great Percy Rebellion was over. Hotspur was dead. Worcester was dead. The first Earl was dead. The family's lands were forfeit, their titles stripped, their castles seized. It seemed for a moment as though the House of Percy had been destroyed. But the Percys had one thing that no defeat could take from them: an heir. Hotspur had left behind a son, a boy named Henry, who had been too young to fight at Shrewsbury. This boy, raised in the shadow of his father's fame and his grandfather's ruin, would grow up to become the second Earl of Northumberland. And he would carry the Percy name back into the heart of English power, though the road would lead, once again, through war and death. The restoration of the Percy fortunes after Shrewsbury and Bramham Moor was slow, painful, and incomplete. Hotspur's son, Henry, spent years in a kind of political limbo. Stripped of his grandfather's titles, denied his father's inheritance, dependent on the grudging tolerance of a Lancastrian king who had every reason to distrust the Percy name. It was not until 1416, more than a decade after Shrewsbury, that young Henry was finally restored as the second Earl of Northumberland by King Henry V, the same prince who had fought against his father at Shrewsbury, the same prince who had taken an arrow in the face and refused to leave the field. The second Earl was a Lancastrian loyalist, perhaps by conviction, perhaps by necessity, or perhaps by that peculiar mixture of both that defines so many political allegiances. The Lancastrian kings had destroyed his family, but they had also restored it. They had taken his grandfather's earldom and his father's life, but they had given both back to the son. It was a debt that could never be fully repaid, and the second Earl seemed to feel its weight throughout his life. He served the House of Lancaster with an unwavering steadiness that earned him respect, if not always gratitude, from the Lancastrian court. But the England of the mid-15th century was a kingdom in crisis. King Henry VI, who had inherited the throne as an infant in 1422, had grown into a man who was, by almost any measure, unsuited to the demands of medieval kingship. He was pious, gentle, scholarly, and well-meaning, qualities that would have served admirably in a monk or a scholar, but which were woefully inadequate in a king who needed to manage ambitious nobles, fight costly wars, and impose his will on a fractious and violent society. He suffered from bouts of mental illness, periods of complete withdrawal from the world, during which he could not speak, move, or recognize the people around him. The first of these episodes struck in 1453, and it plunged the kingdom into a political crisis from which it would not recover for 30 years. When the political skies darkened, when the weak and troubled reign of King Henry VI began to crack under the weight of faction, misgovernment, and the simmering rivalries of the great noble houses. The second Earl of Northumberland remained faithful to the Lancastrian cause. It was a faithfulness that would cost him his life. But faithfulness in the England of the 1450s was a dangerous quality, for the Percys were about to be drawn into a conflict that dwarfed anything they had faced before. a conflict that would tear the kingdom apart, consume the great families of England one by one, and become known to history as the Wars of the Roses. And at the heart of that conflict, driving it forward with a fury that contemporaries compared to the raging of giants, was the great feud between the Percys and the Nevilles. The Neville family had been powerful in the north of England for generations. Not as powerful as the Percys, perhaps, but formidable nonetheless. They held vast estates across Yorkshire and the border counties, and through a series of brilliant marriages, they had connected themselves to the royal house and to some of the wealthiest families in England. The head of the most important branch of the family was Richard Neville, the Earl of Salisbury, a shrewd, calculating man whose ambitions for his family were limitless. The Percy-Neville feud had been simmering for years, fueled by overlapping claims to land, influence, and the lucrative offices of the Scottish border. But it was the younger generation of both families that turned a manageable rivalry into open warfare. On the Percy side, the chief troublemaker was Thomas Percy, Lord Egremont, a younger son of the second Earl, described by one historian as quarrelsome, violent, and contemptuous of all authority. Egremont was a man who seemed to live for conflict. On the Neville side, his counterpart was John Neville, equally aggressive, equally unwilling to back down. The flashpoint came in 1453. A Neville marriage, the wedding of Thomas Neville, a son of the Earl of Salisbury, to Maud Stanhope, threatened to bring former Percy lands into Neville hands. Lord Egremont found this intolerable. On the 24th of August 1453, he led a force of several hundred men to intercept the Neville wedding party at Heworth Moor, near York. A skirmish broke out. Not a full battle, but a violent clash that left blood on both sides and shattered any pretense of peace between the two families. What followed was a private war that the Crown could not control. Percy and Neville retainers raided each other's estates, smashed windows, broke into houses, evicted tenants, and threatened to hang anyone who sheltered their enemies. King Henry VI, who was already struggling to govern a fractious kingdom, sent letters ordering both earls to restrain their sons. The letters were ignored. By October 1453, the Percys had gathered 10,000 men at Topcliffe. Just 4 miles away, at Sheriff Hutton, the Nevilles had assembled their own army. England stood on the edge of civil war, not between kings, but between subjects. The wider political crisis intervened before the two armies could clash directly, but the damage was done. The Percy-Neville feud had poisoned the politics of northern England, and when the broader conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York finally erupted into open war, the Percys and the Nevilles lined up on opposite sides. The Percys for Lancaster, the Nevilles for York. The Wars of the Roses consumed the Percy family like fire consuming dry wood. On the 22nd of May, 1455, at the First Battle of St. Albans, the second Earl of Northumberland was killed. He died fighting for King Henry VI, struck down in the narrow streets of the town as the Yorkist forces overwhelmed the Lancastrian defenders. He was 62 years old. His son, the third Earl, took up the cause. Henry Percy, the third Earl of Northumberland, was a man whose entire adult life had been shaped by the twin forces of the Neville feud and the Lancastrian cause. He fought with grim determination, knowing that defeat would mean not just the loss of power, but the destruction of everything his family had built. The end came on the 29th of March, 1461, at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, and one of the most terrible days in the entire history of the British Isles. The battle was fought on a bleak plateau in Yorkshire between the villages of Towton and Saxton. A snowstorm was blowing, not a gentle fall, but a driving, bitter blizzard that swept across the open ground and made it almost impossible to see. The Lancastrian army, under the command of the Duke of Somerset and the northern Earls, held the higher ground. The Yorkist army, led by the new claimant to the throne, Edward, Earl of March, soon to be crowned Edward IV, approached from the south. The fighting began in the late morning and continued all day, hour after hour of savage close-quarters combat in the snow. The Yorkist archers, aided by the wind at their backs, were able to outrange their Lancastrian opponents, and their volleys tore gaps in the Lancastrian lines. But the Lancastrians held their ground with desperate courage, and the battle swayed back and forth across the frozen field as thousands of men fought and died in the swirling white. The turning point came in the afternoon, when a fresh Yorkist force, the Duke of Norfolk's contingent, which had been delayed on the march, arrived on the battlefield and struck the Lancastrian left flank. The Lancastrian line began to buckle, then to break. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. Men were cut down as they fled, driven into the swollen waters of the River Cock, where many drowned. The snow turned red for hundreds of yards in every direction. The exact number of dead has been debated for centuries, but contemporaries spoke of 20,000, 30,000, even 40,000 killed. Numbers that, even if exaggerated, reflect the scale of the slaughter. Towton was the largest and most destructive battle in the entire Wars of the Roses, and its aftermath was merciless. Prisoners were taken, but few were spared. It was a day of annihilation. Among the fallen was the third Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy. He was 39 years old, the same age at which Hotspur had died at Shrewsbury 58 years earlier. Like his grandfather, the third Earl died in battle, fighting for a cause he believed in, and a king he had sworn to serve. With the third Earl's death, the earldom of Northumberland was forfeit to the Yorkist crown. For a time, the title was given to a Neville. John Neville, Viscount Montague, the very family the Percys had fought so bitterly. It was the deepest humiliation the House of Percy had ever suffered. But the Percys, as they had done before, survived. The third Earl had left behind a son, another Henry, born around 1449. This boy had been an adolescent when his father fell at Towton. He was imprisoned by the Yorkists, first in the Fleet Prison, then in the Tower of London. But he was not executed. And as the years passed, and as King Edward IV consolidated his power, the new king came to see the value of a tame Percy on the border, a lord who could command the loyalty of the northern men in a way that no outsider ever could. In 1470, Edward IV restored young Henry as the fourth Earl of Northumberland. The Percys were back. The fourth Earl walked a narrow and treacherous path. He served Edward IV loyally enough, or at least quietly enough. And when the great crisis of the Yorkist dynasty came in 1485, he found himself in an impossible position. At the Battle of Bosworth, on the 22nd of August, 1485, the fourth Earl commanded a significant portion of King Richard III's army. He was positioned in the rearguard with thousands of men under his command, and he did nothing. The moment is one of the great might-have-beens of English history. If the fourth Earl had committed his men, if he had thrown his weight behind Richard III at the critical moment, the Battle of Bosworth might have ended very differently. Richard's charge against Henry Tudor was bold and nearly successful. The king came within striking distance of his rival before he was overwhelmed. A few thousand fresh troops thrown into the fight at the right moment could have tipped the balance. The fourth Earl had those troops, and he kept them where they stood. As Richard charged to his death, as Henry Tudor's forces closed in, as the crown of England rolled beneath a hawthorn bush on a Leicestershire hillside, the fourth Earl of Northumberland simply watched. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He held his position and let the battle unfold without him. And when it was over, Richard was dead, and Henry Tudor was king. Whether the fourth Earl's inaction was deliberate treachery, a calculated decision to let Richard fall and then make his peace with the victor, or cautious self-preservation born of a lifetime spent learning that the wrong choice could mean ruin, or simply the result of confusion on a chaotic battlefield, is a question that has never been fully answered. Some historians have suggested that the Earl had already reached an understanding with Henry Tudor's agents before the battle, agreeing to stand aside in exchange for the preservation of his estates and titles. Others argue that the Earl was genuinely uncertain, caught between loyalties, paralyzed by the knowledge that either choice might prove fatal. What is certain is that the new King Henry VII was not entirely grateful. The fourth Earl was briefly imprisoned, then released and restored to his offices. But the suspicion lingered, the suspicion that this Percy, like so many before him, could not be fully trusted. The fourth Earl's end came not on a battlefield, but in a far more ignominious way. In 1489, King Henry VII imposed heavy taxes on the people of Yorkshire to fund a war in defence of Brittany against France. The northern people, who had already been bled dry by decades of border warfare and civil conflict, were furious. A rebellion erupted, not against the king directly, but against the local lord who was seen as the king's agent and the enforcer of the hated taxes. That lord was the fourth Earl of Northumberland. On the 28th of April, 1489, a mob attacked the Earl at one of his Yorkshire residences near Thirsk. They killed him. He was about 40 years old. It was a sordid and shocking end for one of the greatest names in England. The fourth Earl was buried at Beverley Minster, and his death left a vacuum of power in the north that would take decades to fill. Some historians have even suggested that King Henry VII was not entirely displeased by the Earl's death, that the removal of this unpredictable, overmighty subject suited the king's purposes rather well. 3 Earls, the second, the third, and the fourth, had died violently within a span of 34 years. The House of Percy had paid for the Wars of the Roses in blood, generation after generation. And yet, once again, there was a son to carry the name forward. The 5th Earl of Northumberland, Henry Algernon Percy, came into his inheritance in 1489, the same year his father was murdered by a Yorkshire mob. He was just 11 years old, and he inherited a family name that carried with it as much danger as honour. But the 5th Earl was a different kind of Percy. Where his ancestors had been border warriors and kingmakers, he became a courtier, a man who sought power not through rebellion, but through magnificence. He earned the nickname the Magnificent for the sheer splendour of his household. His retinue was enormous, his entertainments lavish, his display of wealth and status calculated to remind everyone who saw him that the Percys were still among the greatest families in England. He served King Henry VIII in the early years of that tempestuous reign, and he navigated the dangerous waters of the Tudor court with a steadiness that his ancestors might have envied. He died in 1527 at the age of 49, leaving behind a son who would become one of the most tragic figures in the entire Percy story. Henry Percy, the 6th Earl of Northumberland, was born around 1502. He was sent to London as a young man to be educated in the household of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the most powerful minister in England, the man who ran the country on behalf of King Henry VIII. It was in the orbit of the court, while serving in Wolsey's household, that young Henry Percy met a girl. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Anne had recently returned to England from the French court, where she had spent several years in the service of Queen Claude of France, acquiring the polish, wit, and cultural sophistication that set her apart from most of the young women at the English court. She was not conventionally beautiful. The standards of the age favoured fair-haired, pale-skinned women, and Anne was dark-haired and dark-eyed, with an olive complexion and a long, graceful neck. But she had something more valuable than beauty. She had presence. She was witty, sharp-tongued, accomplished in music and dance, fluent in French, and possessed of an intelligence that drew people to her like moths to a flame. Young Henry Percy, dutiful and somewhat awkward, was not immune to her charm. He fell deeply, helplessly in love with her, and Anne, for her part, appears to have returned his feelings, or, at the very least, she was willing to accept the match. A union with the heir to the Northumberland earldom would have been a brilliant marriage for the daughter of a knight, and Anne was ambitious enough to recognise its value. The two became secretly betrothed, probably in the spring of 1523. It was a match that, on paper, might have seemed reasonable. The heir to one of the greatest earldoms in England and the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, a rising courtier. But the betrothal had been made without the knowledge or consent of either Percy's father or the king, and that was a serious breach of the rules that governed aristocratic marriages. When Cardinal Wolsey learned of the secret betrothal, he was furious. He scolded young Percy publicly before the entire household, shaming him in front of his peers. Percy's father, the 5th Earl, was equally angry. He reportedly called his son a proud, presumptuous, and unthrift waster, and threatened him with disinheritance. The father's objection was partly about protocol, but it was also about snobbery. He considered Anne Boleyn, the daughter of a mere knight, to be beneath his son's station. The betrothal was broken. Young Percy was sent home and quickly married to Lady Mary Talbot, the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. It was a political match, devoid of love, and by all accounts the marriage was deeply unhappy. Percy and Mary Talbot would spend much of their lives in bitter mutual resentment. As for Anne Boleyn, she went on to catch the eye of King Henry VIII himself. Whether the king had already been interested in Anne before the Percy betrothal was broken, whether Wolsey's intervention was motivated not by protocol, but by a royal command to clear the way for the king's own pursuit, is a question that historians have debated for centuries. What is certain is that Anne Boleyn's path led from young Henry Percy's arms to the throne of England. She became Henry VIII's second queen, and her story, the love affair, the break with Rome, the birth of Elizabeth, the fall, the scaffold, became one of the most famous dramas in English history. For Henry Percy, the 6th Earl, the loss of Anne Boleyn haunted the rest of his life. He inherited the earldom on his father's death in 1527 and took up the responsibilities of his station, serving as warden of the East and Middle Marches, sitting on the King's Council, managing the Percy estates. But his health was poor, his marriage was miserable, and the shadow of Anne Boleyn fell across everything. In 1536, that shadow reached its darkest point. Anne Boleyn had been queen for 3 years. She had given the king a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. But she had failed to produce the male heir that Henry desperately wanted. The king had grown tired of her, and his ministers, led by Thomas Cromwell, were building a case against her. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges that most historians believe were entirely fabricated. The 6th Earl of Northumberland was appointed to the panel of peers who would sit in judgment on the Queen. And so Henry Percy found himself in the terrible position of passing a verdict on the woman he had once loved, the woman he had wanted to marry, the woman who had been taken from him by the very king who now wanted her dead. The trial was held on the 15th of May, 1536, in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. 2,000 spectators crowded into the hall to watch, and 26 peers of the realm sat in judgment, men who understood perfectly well that the king expected a guilty verdict, and that to deliver any other would be to risk their own lives and fortunes. Anne defended herself with extraordinary courage and dignity. She answered every charge clearly and calmly, denying the accusations of adultery and treason with a composure that impressed even her enemies. But the outcome was never truly in doubt. The evidence, such as it was, had been assembled by Thomas Cromwell with a single purpose in mind, and the peers understood what was expected of them. One by one they delivered their verdict, guilty. And when the verdict was pronounced, when the word was spoken aloud, and the sentence of death was passed upon the woman he had loved, the woman he had wanted to marry, the woman who had been taken from him by the very king who now wanted her dead, the sixth Earl of Northumberland collapsed. He fainted, or his body simply gave way under the weight of emotion and illness, and he had to be carried bodily out of the great hall. The scene was noticed by everyone present. Some saw in it a sign of his own guilt, a guilty conscience manifesting in physical breakdown. Others saw something simpler and more human. A man who had been asked to do something unbearable and whose body had refused to let him do it. He was too ill to attend the subsequent trial of Anne's brother, George Boleyn, who was also convicted of treason and incest. Charges that were, if anything, even more transparently fabricated than those brought against the Queen, and who was executed alongside his sister. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536. The sixth Earl survived her by just over a year. He died on the 29th of June, 1537, at Hackney, broken in health and spirit. He was about 35 years old. He died without children. His marriage to Mary Talbot had produced no heirs, and in a final act of spite, or perhaps despair, he had arranged his affairs so that the Percy estates would pass not to his own family, but to the crown. He bequeathed his remaining lands to King Henry VIII, deliberately disinheriting his Percy relatives as much as the law allowed. The earldom of Northumberland lapsed. The Percy estates were forfeit, and for the second time in the family's history, it seemed as though the name might be finished. But there were still Percys left. The sixth Earl had brothers, and one of them, Sir Thomas Percy, had already set the family on a collision course with the crown that would lead, once again, to the scaffold. In the autumn of 1536, the north of England erupted in the greatest popular uprising of the Tudor age, the Pilgrimage of Grace. The causes of the rebellion were deep and tangled. Henry VIII's break with Rome, his decision to make himself supreme head of the Church of England, to reject the authority of the Pope, and to seize the wealth and property of the monasteries, had sent shockwaves through every level of English society. But the impact was felt most keenly in the north, where the monasteries were not merely religious institutions but vital centres of community life. They provided charity to the poor, education to the young, hospitality to travellers, and employment to hundreds of local families. When the king's commissioners arrived to close the monasteries, strip their altars, sell their lead and timber, and turn their monks and nuns out into the world, they were not simply reforming the church. They were dismantling the social fabric of the northern countryside. Tens of thousands of ordinary people, farmers, tradesmen, clergy, monks, and minor gentry, rose in protest. They marched under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ, carrying crosses and religious banners, and they called themselves pilgrims rather than rebels. Their demands were clear: restore the monasteries, return the church to Rome, remove Thomas Cromwell and the other architects of the religious revolution, and protect the old faith that had sustained the people of the north for centuries. Sir Thomas Percy, the sixth Earl's brother, joined the uprising. Or rather, he joined the follow-up rebellion led by Sir Francis Bigod, which erupted in early 1537 after the king broke the promises he had made to the original pilgrimage leaders. It was a fatal miscalculation. The king's vengeance was swift and merciless. On the 2nd of June, 1537, Sir Thomas Percy was hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn. He was about 33 years old. His death, coming just weeks before his brother the sixth Earl died of illness, seemed to mark the final destruction of the House of Percy. The earldom was extinct. The estates were in the hands of the crown. 2 Percy brothers were dead, one on the scaffold, one in his bed, and there was no Earl of Northumberland to carry the name forward. And yet, impossibly, the story continued. Sir Thomas Percy had left behind children, and the eldest of them, a boy also named Thomas, would one day reclaim everything that had been lost. The boy who would save the House of Percy grew up in obscurity. Young Thomas Percy, the son of the executed Sir Thomas, was born in 1528, and by the time of his father's death in 1537, he was just 9 years old. His father had died a traitor, his uncle the sixth Earl had died broken and childless, and the Percy estates had been swallowed by the crown. By every measure of Tudor politics, the Percy name should have been finished. But the Tudors, for all their ruthlessness, understood that destroying a great family entirely was sometimes more dangerous than controlling it. The north of England was vast, remote and restless, and the crown's grip on the northern counties was always tenuous. The Percys, even disgraced, even dispossessed, still commanded a loyalty among the northern people that no royal appointee could match. A tame Percy, restored to just enough power to be useful, but not enough to be dangerous, might serve the crown's purposes better than no Percy at all. And so, when the political winds shifted, the Percys were allowed to creep back. Under King Edward VI, some of the Percy lands were cautiously returned to young Thomas. But the real transformation came with the accession of Mary I in 1553. Mary was a Catholic queen in a country that had been wrenched through decades of Protestant Reformation, and she needed loyal Catholic allies, especially in the north, where the old faith had never been fully displaced. The Percys had always been Catholic, deeply and defiantly Catholic, and their faith had been part of the reason they had suffered under Henry VIII and Edward VI. In 1557, Queen Mary restored the earldom of Northumberland to Thomas Percy, making him the 7th Earl. It was a remarkable resurrection. The son of a man who had been hanged, drawn, and quartered for treason was now restored to one of the most ancient and prestigious titles in England. The Percy phoenix had risen from the ashes once more. But the 7th Earl was not a man who had learned caution from his family's long history of disaster. He was a passionate Catholic, a proud northerner, and a man who believed that the old ways, the old faith, the old feudal loyalties, the old Percy dominance of the north, could and should be restored. When the Protestant Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, the 7th Earl found himself on the wrong side of history once again. The crisis came in 1569, and it was the greatest domestic challenge to Elizabeth's rule. Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic queen who had been forced to flee her own kingdom, was being held prisoner in England, a dangerous guest whose very existence was a threat to the Protestant Elizabeth. Catholic plots swirled around Mary like smoke, and at the centre of the most ambitious of these plots were the Northern Earls, Thomas Percy, 7th Earl of Northumberland, and Charles Neville, 6th Earl of Westmoreland. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. The Northern Earls would rise in rebellion, free Mary from her imprisonment, force Elizabeth to grant religious toleration to Catholics, and possibly replace Elizabeth with Mary on the English throne. The rebellion would be supported by Spain, by the Pope, and by Catholic sympathisers throughout England. In November 1569, the rising of the North began. The Earls gathered their forces, their tenants, their retainers, the Catholic gentry of the northern counties who had been quietly seething under the Protestant settlement for years. and marched south from their strongholds. They entered Durham on the 14th of November and made their way to the great cathedral, where they celebrated a solemn Catholic Mass. The first to be held there since Elizabeth's Protestant reforms had swept away the old liturgy. They tore up the Protestant prayer books and the English Bible, restoring the Latin rites that had been the spiritual heartbeat of the North for centuries. Church bells rang across the countryside. Crosses were raised, banners bearing the 5 wounds of Christ. The same symbol that had rallied the Pilgrimage of Grace 33 years earlier were unfurled once more. For a few exhilarating weeks it seemed as though the Old North, the Catholic, feudal, Percy and Neville North, had risen from the dead. The rebels' army swelled as ordinary people joined the march, drawn by loyalty to their lords, by devotion to the old faith, and by a deep-rooted resentment of the distant Protestant government in London that seemed to care nothing for the customs and traditions of the North. But Elizabeth's government was stronger, more organised and more ruthless than the rebels had calculated. The Royal Council moved swiftly to contain the rebellion, dispatching loyal forces northward, and the promised support from abroad, from Spain, from the Pope, from Catholic allies on the continent, never materialised. The great Catholic powers who had given the northern Earls every reason to believe that help would come left them to face the might of the English crown alone. The royal army marched north, and the rebel forces melted away. By December, the rising was over. The Earl of Westmoreland fled to the continent and lived out the rest of his life in exile. The 7th Earl of Northumberland fled to Scotland, hoping to find sanctuary across the border. He found none. The Scottish regent, needing English goodwill, sold the 7th Earl back to the English government for a payment of £2,000. It was a bitter irony. The Percys, who had spent centuries guarding the border against the Scots, were now betrayed by them. The 7th Earl spent nearly 3 years in Scotland, moving from one hiding place to another, hoping against hope that some turn of fortune might save him. But Elizabeth's government was patient and relentless. Eventually, the Scottish regent, the Earl of Moray, and later the Earl of Mar, agreed to hand the fugitive over. The price was £2,000 sterling, a sum that represented, in the most literal and humiliating terms, the value that Scotland placed on Percy loyalty. On the 22nd of August 1572, Thomas Percy, 7th Earl of Northumberland, was beheaded in the pavement at York, the same city where so many of his ancestors had exercised their power and authority. He was about 44 years old. He died professing his Catholic faith to the last, declaring on the scaffold that he had acted in defence of the true religion, and that he accepted his death as God's will. In the aftermath of the Rising, Elizabeth's government exacted a terrible vengeance on the north. Hundreds of ordinary people, the farmers, tradesmen, and labourers who had followed their lords into rebellion, were hanged in towns and villages across Yorkshire, Durham, and Northumberland. The executions were carried out systematically, designed not merely as punishment, but as a lesson. A demonstration that rebellion against the Protestant crown would be met with overwhelming and merciless force. The North would not rise again for generations. In later centuries, the Catholic Church would beatify the 7th Earl, declaring him Blessed Thomas Percy, a martyr for the faith. It was a recognition that, for all the political calculations and feudal ambitions that had shaped the rising of the North, at its heart had been a genuine conflict of conscience, a clash between the old religion and the new, between the Catholic North and the Protestant South, between a way of life that was dying and a new order that was being born. The earldom passed to his brother Henry, who became the 8th Earl of Northumberland. The 8th Earl had remained loyal to Elizabeth during the Rising. He had actually fought against his own brother, joining the royal forces and vigorously attacking the rebels. Elizabeth, in gratitude, allowed him to inherit the title. But the 8th Earl's loyalty was not as deep as it appeared. Over the years that followed, he was gradually drawn into the web of Catholic plotting that surrounded Mary, Queen of Scots. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1571 for his connection to the Ridolfi plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. He was released, fined, and placed under house arrest at Petworth, the Percy estate in Sussex. He was imprisoned again in 1582 in connection with the Throckmorton plot, another Catholic conspiracy. And in December 1584, he was sent to the Tower for a third time. On the night of the 20th of June, 1585, the 8th Earl of Northumberland was found dead in his cell. He had been shot through the heart. The official verdict was suicide. The coroner's inquest held in the Star Chamber declared that the Earl had killed himself to spare his family from yet another attainder and the loss of the Percy estates. A pistol was found beside the body, but very few people believed it. Catholics whispered that the Earl had been murdered, that he had been shot 3 times in the chest, which was hardly consistent with suicide. Rumours pointed to Sir Christopher Hatton, one of Elizabeth's most trusted courtiers, as the man who had ordered the killing. Years later, Sir Walter Raleigh would write a private letter referring to Hatton's guilt in the matter. The truth of the 8th Earl's death has never been established with certainty, and perhaps it never will be. What is certain is that another Percy had died in the Tower. Another link in the long chain of violence that bound the family to the crown it served and defied in equal measure. The 8th Earl left behind children, including a son who would inherit the title and become one of the most remarkable men in the entire Percy story. A man who would turn away from warfare and rebellion entirely and lose himself instead in the quiet, dangerous world of science, alchemy, and forbidden knowledge. Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, was born on the 27th of April, 1564, at Tynemouth Castle in Northumberland. He was 21 years old when his father was found dead in the Tower, and he inherited an earldom that carried with it a legacy of rebellion, suspicion, and violent death that would have crushed a lesser spirit. But the 9th Earl was not like his predecessors. Where they had been soldiers, he was a scholar. Where they had sought power through war and political conspiracy, he sought it through knowledge, through the systematic investigation of the natural world, through mathematics and astronomy, through the ancient art of alchemy, through the patient accumulation of books and instruments and the company of brilliant minds. He became known as the Wizard Earl, not because he practiced magic in the superstitious sense, but because his interests seemed to the people of his time to border on the mysterious. He was fascinated by cartography, by navigation, by the new sciences that were beginning to transform European understanding of the universe. He assembled one of the largest private libraries in England, filling his houses with books on every subject from astronomy to natural philosophy, and he gathered around him a circle of scholars and experimenters, men who would later be called the Magi, who pursued their investigations under his patronage and protection. The most famous of these scholars was Thomas Harriot, a mathematician and astronomer of extraordinary ability. Harriot had accompanied Sir Walter Raleigh on his early voyages to the New World, and he brought to the 9th Earl's household a mind that ranged across mathematics, optics, astronomy, and linguistics. Under the Earl's patronage, Harriot observed the heavens through early telescopes, developed new mathematical techniques, and corresponded with some of the finest minds in Europe. Other members of the circle included Walter Warner and Robert Hughes, both scholars of distinction. Together, this group pursued their work at the Earl's principal residences, Sion House, the Grand Percy estate on the Thames near London, and Petworth House in Sussex. The atmosphere in these houses was that of a private university. a place where ideas were tested, experiments were conducted, and the boundaries of human knowledge were quietly pushed forward. The 9th Earl married Lady Dorothy Devereux in 1594. Dorothy was the sister of Robert Devereux, the 2nd Earl of Essex, one of Elizabeth I's most famous favourites, and a man whose own reckless ambition would lead him to rebellion and the scaffold in 1601. The marriage connected the 9th Earl to one of the most glamorous and dangerous families in Elizabethan England, and it would prove to be a source of both companionship and sorrow. Dorothy was devoted to her husband, visiting him faithfully during his long years of imprisonment, and her death in 1619 would leave the Earl bereft. For the 9th Earl's life, like those of so many Percys before him, would be defined by imprisonment. The catastrophe came in 1605, and it bore a name that still echoes through English history: the Gunpowder Plot. On the 5th of November, 1605, the most infamous conspiracy in English history was uncovered. A group of Catholic plotters, desperate men who had been driven to extremes by years of persecution and broken promises, had conceived a plan of staggering ambition and horrifying violence. They intended to blow up the Houses of Parliament during the state opening, killing King James I, the assembled Lords and Commons, the bishops, the judges, and every senior figure of the Protestant establishment in a single, devastating explosion. From the ashes, they hoped, a Catholic government could be installed and the old faith would be restored. The plot was discovered on the night of the 4th of November, when one of the conspirators, Guy Fawkes, was found in the cellars beneath the Palace of Westminster. He was guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough explosive force to reduce the entire building and everyone in it to rubble. Fawkes was arrested, tortured, and forced to reveal the names of his fellow conspirators. Among the chief conspirators was a man named Thomas Percy, a distant cousin of the 9th Earl and a member of his household. Thomas Percy was the Earl's estate manager, a trusted servant who had handled his business affairs for years. He was also, it turned out, one of the 5 principal architects of the most infamous conspiracy in English history. The connection to Thomas Percy was devastating for the 9th Earl. On the 4th of November, the day before the plot was discovered, the Earl had dined with his cousin Thomas at Syon House. The two men had shared a meal, discussed estate business, and parted. The next day, Guy Fawkes was discovered with the gunpowder. Thomas Percy fled, was tracked to Holbeach House in Staffordshire, and was shot dead, killed, according to some accounts, by the same bullet that also killed Robert Catesby, the mastermind of the plot. The 9th Earl insisted that he had known nothing of the conspiracy, that his dinner with Thomas Percy had been a routine meeting about estate affairs, nothing more. But the Privy Council was not persuaded. The Earl's association with his cousin, his known Catholic sympathies, his history as a member of a family that had rebelled against the crown again and again, all of this made him a natural suspect. He was arrested on the 27th of November, 1605, and sent to the Tower of London. In June of the following year, he was tried and convicted, not of treason, which would have meant death, but of contempt. The charge was based on the fact that Thomas Percy had been irregularly appointed to the royal bodyguard on the Earl's recommendation, and that the Earl had made insufficient efforts to track his cousin down after the plot was discovered. It was a thin charge, and the sentence was widely regarded as vindictive. The 9th Earl was fined £30,000, an enormous sum, later reduced to £11,000, stripped of all his offices, and sentenced to life imprisonment in the Tower of London. He would remain there for 16 years. But the 9th Earl was a man of resources, both financial and intellectual, and his imprisonment was not the dark dungeon that the word might suggest. He was wealthy enough to make himself comfortable in the Tower. He took over the Martin Tower, furnished it handsomely, and even had a covered bowling alley installed for his exercise. He continued to read, to study, to correspond with scholars, and to pursue his scientific interests from behind the walls of his prison. And he was not alone. Sir Walter Raleigh, the great explorer, adventurer, and poet, was already a prisoner in the Tower and held under a death sentence for his alleged involvement in the main plot, an earlier conspiracy against King James. Raleigh had been in the Tower since 1603, and by the time the 9th Earl arrived in 1605, Raleigh had already made himself a kind of resident philosopher of the place. Writing his great history of the world, conducting chemical experiments and receiving visitors with the ease of a man holding court rather than serving a sentence. The two men became close friends. They were, in many ways, kindred spirits, both passionate about science and exploration, both victims of political circumstances they had not fully created, both possessed of restless minds that could not be contained even by prison walls. They discussed mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and the nature of the physical world. They debated philosophy and history. They smoked tobacco together, the exotic leaf that Raleigh had helped to popularize in England after his voyages to the Americas. And they filled their rooms with the fragrant smoke while the River Thames flowed past the Tower walls below them. Thomas Harriot, the Earl's chief mathematician, visited regularly, bringing the latest observations and calculations from the world outside. Other scholars came and went, and the Earl's apartments in the Martin Tower became a kind of salon, a place where ideas circulated freely, even as the man at the centre of it all remained a prisoner of the state. The Earl's wife, Dorothy, visited faithfully throughout the long years of his imprisonment. Her devotion was a source of comfort and strength, and when she died in 1619, 4 years before the Earl's release, the loss was devastating. He had spent most of their married life in prison, separated from her by the walls of the Tower, and now she was gone. The 9th Earl was finally released on the 18th of July, 1621, after 16 years of imprisonment. He was 57 years old, and the world he emerged into was very different from the one he had left. He was 57 years old. He retired to Petworth House, where he lived quietly for the remaining years of his life, tending his gardens, managing his estates, and pursuing his studies in peaceful obscurity. He died on the 5th of November, 1632, the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot. He was 68 years old. Whether the date of his death was coincidence or cosmic irony, it was a fitting end for a man whose life had been shaped by that single night of conspiracy and discovery. He was buried at Petworth within 24 hours of his death. The Wizard Earl was, in many ways, the most sympathetic of the Percys. A man who sought truth rather than power, who preferred the company of scholars to the company of soldiers, and who paid for the sins of his family and his cousin with 16 years of his life. He left behind a legacy of learning and patronage that stood in quiet contrast to the legacy of rebellion and violence that had defined the Percys for 300 years. The 9th Earl's eldest surviving son, Algernon Percy, became the 10th Earl of Northumberland in 1632. Algernon was 30 years old, and he inherited an earldom that had been humbled and diminished by his father's long imprisonment, but one that still carried immense prestige and wealth. Algernon was a man of moderate temperament, careful judgment, and a pragmatism that set him apart from the hot-headed Percys of earlier centuries. He had been educated at Cambridge, served in Parliament, married well. His first wife was Lady Anne Cecil, daughter of the Earl of Exeter, and cultivated the connections that would make him one of the most influential peers of his generation. In 1635, he was made a Knight of the Garter. In 1636, he commanded a fleet as Admiral, and in 1638 he was appointed Lord High Admiral of England, one of the great offices of state, carrying with it responsibility for the entire Royal Navy. But the world into which Algernon Percy had risen was a world on the edge of catastrophe. The reign of King Charles I was sliding towards civil war. The king's attempts to rule without parliament, his imposition of unpopular taxes, his religious policies, and his stubborn refusal to compromise with his critics were driving the nation toward a conflict that would tear it apart. For the Percys, the coming of the English Civil War presented an extraordinary dilemma. For centuries, the family had defined itself through its relationship with the crown, sometimes loyal, sometimes rebellious, but always oriented toward the monarchy as the source of power and legitimacy. Now, for the first time, a Percy was being asked to choose not between one king and another, but between the king and Parliament. Algernon Percy chose Parliament. It was a decision that shocked many of his contemporaries, and it requires some explanation. The 10th Earl had not turned against the monarchy as an institution. He remained all his life a supporter of constitutional monarchy, a man who believed that the king should rule, but that he should rule within the law and with the consent of Parliament. What Algernon opposed was not kingship itself, but the personal rule of Charles I, a king who seemed determined to govern without restraint or accountability. There were also family reasons. The Percys had been barred from visiting their northern estates for decades. Ever since the rising of the North in 1569, successive earls had been forbidden to travel to Northumberland, kept at a distance from the source of their traditional power. This enforced exile from the north had weakened the family's attachment to the feudal loyalties that might otherwise have drawn them to the royalist cause. And Algernon's cousin, the 3rd Earl of Essex, was one of the leading parliamentary generals, a family connection that pulled the 10th Earl toward the parliamentary side. When the Civil War began in 1642, Algernon Percy's position as Lord High Admiral gave Parliament a critical advantage. His support helped secure the Royal Navy for the parliamentary cause, denying the king control of the seas, and depriving him of a vital strategic asset. Throughout the war, the 10th Earl served Parliament in a variety of roles. As a member of the Committee of Safety, as one of the Committee of Both Kingdoms that coordinated the war effort, and as a political leader of the moderate, peace-seeking faction within the parliamentary coalition. He helped organize the new model army, the professional, disciplined fighting force that would ultimately win the war for Parliament. And he used his influence to promote reconciliation with the king whenever an opportunity arose. He was not a radical. He had no sympathy for the religious zealots and social levellers who were emerging within the parliamentary coalition, and he viewed with growing alarm the power of Oliver Cromwell and the army officers who seemed determined to push the revolution further than men like Algernon had ever intended. He wanted not the destruction of the monarchy, but its reform, a settlement that would preserve the crown while limiting its power, a constitutional arrangement that would prevent any future king from ruling as Charles had tried to rule. In 1646, when King Charles was defeated and captured, the 10th Earl was entrusted with one of the most sensitive duties of the entire war. He was made guardian of the king's 2 youngest children, the Duke of York and Princess Elizabeth. It was a role that spoke to his reputation for honour and moderation. Even the king's enemies trusted him to treat the royal children with care and dignity. But when the radicals in Parliament and the army moved toward the ultimate step, the trial and execution of the king, Algernon Percy drew the line. He led the opposition in the House of Lords against the proposal to put Charles on trial, and he took no part in the proceedings that led to the king's beheading on the 30th of January, 1649. For the 10th Earl, the execution of the king was a step too far, a violation of the constitutional principles he had fought to defend. During the years of the Commonwealth and the Protectorate that followed, Algernon withdrew from public life. He took no part in the government of Oliver Cromwell, living quietly at Petworth and waiting for the political tide to turn. When it did, when the monarchy was restored in 1660 and Charles II returned to England, the 10th Earl was among the first to be reconciled. He was called to the new king's Privy Council, and with his habitual moderation, he urged clemency and restraint in the treatment of those who had served Parliament and the Commonwealth. He argued against harsh punishments for the regicides, counselling mercy over revenge. Algernon Percy, 10th Earl of Northumberland, died on the 13th of October, 1668, at Petworth House. He was 66 years old. He had lived through one of the most turbulent periods in English history: Civil War, regicide, Republic, and Restoration. And he had navigated it all with a steadiness and dignity that set him apart from the fierier Percys who had come before him. His son, Jocelyn Percy, became the 11th Earl of Northumberland. Jocelyn was 24 years old, and he was the last of his line. Jocelyn was a quiet young man, earnest, dutiful, and unremarkable in the public records. He married Lady Elizabeth Wriothesley in 1662, and together they had 2 children, a son, Henry, and a daughter, Elizabeth. But little Henry, Lord Percy, died in infancy, in 1669, at about a year old. It was a devastating blow, not just to his parents, but to the future of the entire House of Percy, for little Henry had been the last hope of the male line. And just months later, on the 31st of May, 1670, Jocelyn Percy himself died. He was only 25 years old, a young man taken before his time, leaving behind a widow and a daughter, and the ruins of a dynasty that had once been the most powerful in the north of England. With Jocelyn's death, the male line of the Percy Earls of Northumberland came to an end. The line that stretched back through the Wizard Earl and his Tower imprisonment, through the Catholic martyrs of the Tudor age, through the great Lancastrian Earls who had fought and died in the Wars of the Roses, through Hotspur and his glorious doomed charge at Shrewsbury, through the first Baron who had bought Alnwick Castle and planted the Percy banner on the Scottish border, through Agnes and Jocelyn of Louvain, who had saved the name in the 12th century, all the way back to William de Percy and his remarkable whiskers in the year 1067. That line was broken. 600 years of continuous male descent had come to a halt. The title lapsed. The Earldom of Northumberland was extinct. There would be no more Percy Earls, no more Wardens of the Marches, no more border lords with private armies and the power to challenge kings. The age of the great medieval dynasties was passing, and the House of Percy seemed to be passing with it. And yet, the story was not over. For the entire vast inheritance of the House of Percy, the castles, the estates, the lands that stretched across Northumberland, Yorkshire, Sussex and London, came to rest upon a single pair of very small shoulders. Jocelyn's daughter, Lady Elizabeth Percy, was 3 years old. She was the last Percy, and she was about to become the most sought-after prize in England. Lady Elizabeth Percy was, by the age of 3, one of the richest people in England. She was the sole surviving child of the last Percy Earl, and she had inherited everything. Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, Petworth House in Sussex, Sion House on the Thames, Northumberland House in London, and vast estates scattered across the kingdom. She was, by any reckoning, the greatest heiress of her generation. And because she was the greatest heiress, she became a prize, a child whose marriage would be fought over, schemed for, and ultimately decided by adults who valued her fortune far more than her happiness. Elizabeth's early life was managed by her grandmother, the Dowager Countess of Northumberland, who understood perfectly well that her granddaughter's marriages would shape the future of the Percy inheritance. The grandmother moved quickly to secure advantageous matches, and Elizabeth's matrimonial career began at an age when most children are learning to read. At the age of 12, in 1679, Elizabeth was married to Henry Cavendish, the Earl of Ogle, a young man of 20, the heir to the Duke of Newcastle. As was required by the marriage settlement, the young husband adopted the Percy surname, becoming Henry Percy, Earl of Ogle. It seemed like the beginning of a union that would merge two of the greatest fortunes in England. But Henry Cavendish died the following year, in 1680. Elizabeth was 13 years old and already a widow. Her second marriage followed almost immediately. In 1681, at the age of 14, she was married to Thomas Thynne of Longleat, one of the wealthiest landowners in the west of England, a man in his mid-30s. The marriage was reportedly unhappy from the start. Elizabeth did not willingly consent to it, and the couple may never have lived together as husband and wife. What happened next was one of the most sensational crimes of the late 17th century. In February 1682, Thomas Thynne was riding in his coach through the streets of London when he was attacked by 3 hired assassins. They shot him, and he died of his wounds. The assassination had been orchestrated by Count Karl Johann von Königsmarck, a Swedish nobleman who had become infatuated with Elizabeth Percy and was determined to have her for himself. Königsmarck had met Elizabeth at court and had been captivated, not perhaps by the 15-year-old girl herself, but by the staggering fortune that came with her. If Thomas Thynne could be removed, Königsmarck calculated, Elizabeth would be free to marry again, and he would present himself as her suitor. The murder caused a sensation. London was scandalized by the brazenness of the crime. A wealthy gentleman shot down in his coach in broad daylight, in one of the most fashionable streets in the city. Königsmarck was arrested and put on trial. But, in a verdict that astonished and outraged public opinion, he was acquitted, possibly because he had powerful friends at court who intervened on his behalf. His 3 hired assassins, who had no such protection, were hanged. The acquittal did Königsmarck little good. He fled England in disgrace and never married Elizabeth Percy. But the affair left its mark on the young heiress, who had now been widowed twice in circumstances that ranged from the sad to the scandalous. She was 15 years old, and she had already seen more of the cruelty and calculation of the world than most people encounter in a lifetime. Elizabeth Percy, at the age of 15, was a widow for the second time. 5 months later, in August 1682, she married for the third time. Her new husband was Charles Seymour, the 6th Duke of Somerset, a man known to his contemporaries and to history as the Proud Duke. The nickname was well earned. Seymour was one of the most arrogant, status-obsessed, and fastidious men of his age. He insisted on being treated with the utmost deference at all times, and he carried himself with a grandeur that even other aristocrats found excessive. Charles Seymour had originally been rebuffed by Elizabeth, who told him, with a composure remarkable in a 15-year-old who had already been widowed twice, that she had no wish to alter her condition and become his wife. But the proud Duke was persistent, and eventually Elizabeth consented. Whether the marriage was happy is a question that the sources leave somewhat ambiguous. Charles Seymour was a man of towering arrogance and rigid formality. He expected his children to stand in his presence, and he is said to have once fined one of his daughters £20,000 for sitting down uninvited. But he was also a man of considerable ability and political influence, and the partnership between him and Elizabeth, if not a love match, was at least an effective one. They had several children, and together they used Elizabeth's enormous wealth to rebuild Petworth House in the fashionable Baroque style, transforming the old Percy Manor into one of the grandest houses in England. The interiors were decorated by the finest craftsmen of the age, including the master woodcarver Grinling Gibbons, whose extraordinary limewood carvings, cascades of flowers, fruits, birds and musical instruments carved with a delicacy and naturalism that has never been surpassed, can still be seen at Petworth today. The French artist Louis Laguerre was commissioned to paint the great staircase hall, filling its walls and ceiling with scenes from classical mythology rendered in the grand manner of Versailles. The house was a statement, a declaration that the Percy fortune, even in the hands of a Seymour, would be used to create something magnificent. Elizabeth became a figure of importance in her own right. She served as Mistress of the Robes to Queen Anne from 1710 to 1714, becoming one of the Queen's closest confidants. She was a woman of intelligence and determination, and she managed her vast inheritance with a competence that belied the turbulent circumstances of her youth. She died on the 23rd of November 1722 at the age of 55. Through her, the Percy blood had passed into the Seymour family, and through the Seymours it would pass once more, into the hands of a family that no one, in Elizabeth Percy's lifetime, could have predicted. Elizabeth's son, Algernon Seymour, became the 7th Duke of Somerset. But when Algernon died in 1750 without a male heir, the Percy inheritance faced yet another crisis of succession. Algernon's daughter, Elizabeth Seymour, who carried the Percy bloodline through her grandmother, had married a man named Sir Hugh Smithson, a baronet of modest origins from Yorkshire. And it was Sir Hugh Smithson who would engineer the most extraordinary reinvention in the entire Percy story. Sir Hugh Smithson was not born a Percy. He was the grandson of a baronet, a man of comfortable but unremarkable social standing, with no connection to the great medieval dynasties that had shaped English history. He had inherited the Smithson baronetcy in 1733, made a grand tour of Europe, and married well. His wife, Elizabeth Seymour, was the granddaughter of the great heiress Elizabeth Percy, and through her, the Percy blood ran in the veins of their children. When Elizabeth Seymour's father, the 7th Duke of Somerset, died in 1750 without a male heir, the vast Percy estates, which had passed from Elizabeth Percy to the Seymours, descended to Elizabeth Seymour and, by extension, to her husband, Hugh Smithson. But with the estates came an expectation, and Smithson was shrewd enough to understand it. In 1749, he changed his surname. He was no longer Hugh Smithson. He was Hugh Percy. It was a bold move, a declaration that he intended to carry forward not just the Percy wealth, but the Percy identity. He was created Earl of Northumberland in a new creation in 1750, and over the following years he set about making himself worthy of the name he had adopted. His greatest project was Alnwick Castle. The castle had fallen into serious disrepair during the centuries when the Percys had been kept away from the north. By the mid-18th century, it was more ruin than residence, a crumbling medieval fortress that had not been properly maintained since the Tudor era. Hugh Percy undertook a massive program of restoration, employing the architect Robert Adam to redesign the interiors in the elegant neoclassical style of the age, and the landscape designer Lancelot Capability Brown to transform the surrounding grounds into a sweeping English parkland. The result was a transformation that bridged the centuries. The medieval shell of Alnwick was preserved. The massive curtain walls, the great gatehouse, the barbican, the imposing silhouette that had glowered over the River Aln since the Norman era. But within those walls, the first Duke created something entirely new. Robert Adams' interiors were elegant, refined, and fashionably neoclassical, with columns, pilasters, and plasterwork that reflected the latest continental fashions. Outside, Capability Brown swept away the old formal gardens and replaced them with the naturalistic English parkland that became his signature. Rolling lawns, carefully positioned trees, serpentine drives, and views that drew the eye across a landscape designed to look as though nature herself had arranged it. The stone soldiers that still stand watch on the battlements. eerie, silent figures gazing out across the landscape, their weapons at the ready, their faces blank, were added during this period. They are not medieval. They are 18th century additions, placed there as a decorative echo of the real garrisons that had once manned the walls. But they serve a deeper purpose. They are a reminder, a quiet, permanent reminder, that this place was once a fortress, that it was built for war, and that the family who lives within it once held the border of England by force of arms. In the soft light of a Northumberland evening, the stone soldiers look almost alive, standing their patient vigil as the centuries pass around them. In 1766, King George III created Hugh Percy as the first Duke of Northumberland. It was the highest title the Percy name had ever carried, higher than the earldom that had been won and won again across 4 centuries of war and rebellion. The former Sir Hugh Smithson, the Yorkshire baronet, had become a duke, and the House of Percy, reborn through the female line for the second time in its history, had reached a new pinnacle. The first duke died in 1786, at the age of about 72. He was buried in the Northumberland vault at Westminster Abbey, a final resting place that reflected the extraordinary distance he had travelled from his modest origins to the summit of the English aristocracy. The first Duke also commissioned the architect Robert Adam to redesign Syon House, the Percy residence on the Thames near London. Adam's interiors at Syon, the Great Hall, the anteroom with its dazzling columns of Verde Antico marble, the graceful Long Gallery, are among the finest examples of neoclassical design in Britain, and they remain essentially unchanged today, a testament to the first Duke's taste and ambition. He left behind, among other children, an illegitimate son named James Smithson, born of a liaison with a woman named Elizabeth Hungerford Keate. James Smithson grew up on the margins of the aristocratic world, acknowledged by his father but unable to inherit any of his titles or estates. He became a chemist and mineralogist of considerable distinction, studying at Oxford and publishing scientific papers that earned him election to the Royal Society. But he carried with him all his life the sting of his illegitimacy, the knowledge that he bore the name of Smithson rather than Percy, that he was excluded from the dynasty his father had rebuilt. When James Smithson died in 1829, he made a bequest that astonished the world. He left his entire fortune, over $500,000, an enormous sum at the time, to the United States of America, a country he had never visited, for the establishment of an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. That institution, the Smithsonian, stands today as one of the greatest museums and research centers on Earth, a sprawling complex of buildings on the National Mall in Washington that attracts millions of visitors each year. It is a remarkable footnote to the Percy story. The idea that an illegitimate son of the man who reinvented the Percy name would, through an act of extraordinary generosity, create one of the most important cultural institutions in human history. The Smithsonian carries the Smithson name, not the Percy name, but behind it lies the Percy fortune, the Percy ambition, and the Percy instinct for leaving a mark on the world that outlasts the individual who made it. The Dukedom of Northumberland, once established, passed from father to son, or, when necessary, from brother to brother, through the generations that followed. The later Percys were, on the whole, quieter figures than their medieval ancestors. They were landowners rather than kingmakers, patrons of arts and sciences rather than leaders of rebellions. The wildness had gone out of the family, replaced by a steady, responsible stewardship of one of the greatest estates in England. The second Duke of Northumberland, Hugh Percy, served as a military officer during some of the most significant conflicts of the 18th century. He fought in the 7 Years' War in Europe, seeing action at the Battle of Minden in 1759, and In a twist of history that would have amused his medieval ancestors, those border warriors who had spent their lives fighting the Scots. The second Duke served in the American War of Independence, commanding British troops at the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775. These were the opening engagements of the Revolution that would create the United States of America, and the second Duke played a significant role in them, leading the relief column that rescued the battered British regulars retreating from Concord back to Boston. It was a long way from Alnwick Castle and the Scottish border, but the Percy instinct for finding themselves at the sharp end of history was as strong as ever. The third Duke served as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1829 to 1830, a demanding political post that required the management of a restive and deeply divided country. He died in 1847, and the dukedom passed to his brother Algernon, the fourth Duke, who became one of the great restorers of the Percy legacy. The fourth Duke was a traveller, an explorer, a patron of the arts and a man of wide-ranging intellectual curiosity. In many ways, a spiritual heir of the wizard Earl, that earlier Percy who had loved science and learning and had paid for it with 16 years in the Tower. The fourth Duke had served in the Royal Navy from the age of 12, rising through the ranks and seeing the world from the deck of a ship. After leaving the Navy at 23, he had travelled extensively across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, developing a deep interest in archaeology, astronomy, art, and architecture. He was a collector, a connoisseur, and a man who believed that the great houses of England should be temples of culture as well as monuments of power. When he inherited the dukedom in 1847 at the age of 50, he brought all of his experience and taste to bear on the restoration of Alnwick Castle. It was the most ambitious programme of renovation the castle had seen since the first Duke's work in the previous century, and it would transform Alnwick into the magnificent showpiece it remains today. Where the first Duke had remodelled Alnwick in the Georgian neoclassical style, the fourth Duke reimagined it in the Italian Renaissance manner, filling the state rooms with paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts of the highest quality, and creating interiors of such richness and beauty that visitors often compared them to the finest palaces on the continent. The fourth Duke's Alnwick was a deliberate statement, a declaration that the Percys, even in the quieter age of the 19th century, were still a family of consequence and culture. The dukedom continued through the later 19th and early 20th centuries. The 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th Dukes, each managing the estates, serving in public life, and maintaining the Percy presence in the north. The 8th Duke, Alan Percy, served in the First World War. The 9th Duke died without a male heir. The 10th Duke, Hugh Percy, came to the title in 1940 and held it for 48 years, the longest tenure of any Duke of Northumberland. He served with the Northumberland Hussars during the Second World War and in the harsh financial climate of post-war Britain. When many great estates were broken up, their houses demolished, their lands sold, he managed the Percy estates with a prudence and steadiness that ensured their survival. It was an achievement that, in its quiet way, was as remarkable as any of the battles and rebellions of earlier centuries. While other aristocratic families watched their fortunes crumble, the 10th Duke kept the Percy inheritance intact. He died in 1988, and the dukedom passed to his eldest son, Henry, the 11th Duke. But the 11th Duke died without children in 1995, and the title passed to his younger brother. Ralph George Algernon Percy, the 12th Duke of Northumberland, is the current head of the House of Percy. He was born on the 16th of November, 1956, at Alnwick Castle, the same castle that his ancestor Henry de Percy had purchased nearly 700 years earlier. He was educated at Eton and at Oxford, where he read modern history, and at the University of Reading, where he studied land management. He worked for 7 years in the estate office at Arundel Castle before returning to Northumberland to manage the family estates. Today, the 12th Duke oversees Northumberland estates, a vast enterprise that manages approximately 100,000 acres of land in Northumberland, Scotland, and other parts of England. The Percy holdings include Alnwick Castle, Warkworth Castle, Prudhoe Castle, Syon House in London, and numerous other properties. The Duke's estimated wealth has placed him among the wealthiest people in Britain. But perhaps the most unexpected chapter in Alnwick Castle's long history came at the turn of the 21st century, when the castle was chosen as a filming location for the Harry Potter series. The grey stone walls and soaring towers of Alnwick, the fortress that had defied Scottish invaders, sheltered Percy rebels, and housed Northumberland's uncrowned kings for 7 centuries, were transformed, for a few magical weeks of filming, into Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. It is a detail that the medieval Percys, those fierce, proud border lords who lived and died by the sword, would scarcely have believed. Their castle, the seat of their power, the stronghold that had witnessed so much blood and ambition and faith and loss, was now a place where children in wizarding robes pretended to fly on broomsticks. And yet, in a strange way, it is entirely fitting. The House of Percy has always been a family that adapted to survive. They began as Norman conquerors and became English lords. They lost the male line and were saved by a woman's marriage. They rebelled and were crushed and came back. They went from warriors to scholars to estate managers to heritage custodians. Each generation reinvented the family for its own age, and each generation found a way to keep the Percy name alive. Alnwick Castle receives more than 600,000 visitors each year. They come to see the Harry Potter locations, to stand in the outer bailey where Harry learned to fly a broomstick, to walk through the corridors where Hogwarts students hurried between classes. They come to see the staterooms with their Italian Renaissance interiors, their paintings by Titian, Canaletto, and Van Dyck. They come to see the Alnwick Garden, created by the current Duchess of Northumberland, a spectacular contemporary garden with the largest tree house in Europe and the most dangerous garden in the world, filled with plants that can kill. But whether they know it or not, what they are really coming to see is the Percy story, nearly 1,000 years of English history, written in stone and blood and stubborn endurance. Every wall, every tower, every windswept courtyard speaks of a family that refused to disappear. They survived the Norman conquest, the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor persecutions, the Gunpowder Plot, the Civil War, the extinction of their male line, and the economic upheavals of the 20th century. They adapted, they reinvented themselves, they married their way back from the brink, and they held on. The family motto is Espérance en Dieu, hope in God. It is painted on walls, carved in stone, embroidered on banners. It has been carried into battle and whispered in prison cells. It has accompanied Percy's to the scaffold and to the coronation. It has been the family's constant companion through 9 centuries of triumph, disaster, and everything in between. And it has held. Through every storm, through every reversal, through every generation that seemed like it might be the last, it has held. The heir to the dukedom is the 12th Duke's eldest son, George Percy. Earl Percy, a young man who will, in time, become the 13th Duke of Northumberland, and who will take his place in a line of succession that reaches back, through all its twists and turns and reinventions, to a Norman lord with unusual whiskers who crossed the Channel in 1067. 959 years. That is how long the House of Percy has endured. From the Norman conquest to the present day, from the harrying of the North to the filming of Harry Potter, from the Motte and Bailey castles of Yorkshire to the grand state rooms of Alnwick, from whiskers to wizards, from swords to science, from rebellion to responsibility. They have been border warriors and courtiers, kingmakers and prisoners, rebels and reformers, scholars and soldiers. They have lost everything more than once, and they have found it again, every time. And so we come to the end of our journey through the long, extraordinary story of the House of Percy, the family that came out of Normandy with whiskers and ambition, that built their power on the wild border of England and Scotland, that made kings and defied them, that lost everything and found it again, and that still, after nearly 1,000 years, lives in the same castle where it all began. The fire in the hearth is burning low now, and the old stories have settled into the quiet of the night. The candles are guttering in their holders, and the shadows have grown long against the walls. Hotspur rides no more across the border. His restless spirit has found its peace at last, somewhere between the pages of Shakespeare and the memories of the North he loved. The wizard Earl has put away his books and his telescopes, and the smoke of his tobacco has long since drifted into nothing. The great Earls are sleeping in their tombs at Beverley and Petworth and Westminster, and the heiress who saved the name, the girl who was married 3 times before she turned 16, has taken her rest beneath the stone floors of a quiet chapel. The north is still, the border is quiet, and the stone soldiers on the battlements of Alnwick stand their endless, patient watch, gazing northward into the darkness as they have done for 300 years. If you've stayed with us through the whole tale, thank you for your company. And if you've already drifted off somewhere along the way, among the battlefields perhaps, or in the candlelit rooms of the tower, then sleep well. The Percys will keep their watch through the night, as they have always done. Good night from Sleepy Nobles.